Good day, and welcome back to our series of talks on rethinking journalism in a context of pressing social justice issues. We have gone through two sessions. In the first session, I highlighted the sort of pressing social justice issues that are prevalent in the global south, but are also beginning to be manifested in some parts of the global north as well, although they are mainly manifested in the global south. Then in the second session, we did talk about decolonial thought and its deconstruction of ethnocentrism as a mode of thought, mode of practice that continues to sustain narratives which present people in the global south as lacking, as not human enough, and whose cultures, knowledge systems, and so forth are not given the same level of recognition as Eurocentric ideas. The idea behind these talks is that we need to rethink journalism in a way that allows us to reflect more constructively, more critically about the sources of pressing justice issues and the appropriate responses to these particular issues, keeping in mind the role of journalism in this process. Today, I'm going to focus on the blind spots in mainstream journalism. In other words, we're going to look at mainstream journalism as a mode of practice, as a culture, as an ideology, and the kind of discourse or narratives that it promotes, and the sort of weaknesses or caveats that it has, especially in terms of addressing social justice issues. Right? So I'll go through the introduction, look at the democratic deficit in mainstream media, the promise of digital media, and the promise of mainstream journalism before concluding. So basically, you know that mainstream journalism is usually associated with institutionalized media organizations, which can be television, newspapers, radio, and other big online media institutions. So those are the typical characteristics. It's institutionalized, the practice is mainstream, the rules, ethics, and guidelines for such practice are usually universal and have a Western-centric bent to them, and the form of journalism is industrial. And this form of journalism has been credited for a long time for sustaining democratic societies, for creating and sustaining democratic societies. And this is beyond doubt. Media, in particular journalistic media, have played a key role in creating and sustaining democratic society. And this has happened through the circulation, generation and circulation of information, and also provision of platforms for critical discussions. Democracies, by their very nature, depend or thrive on the following factors: free access to information by citizens, free circulation of information, free expression or speech, a free press, open and inclusive discussion, as well as diverse content, all this facilitated by plural and diverse media. Traditional news media is, have been the major actor in enabling these conditions, but also in a context that enables such media to operate freely. New digital communication tools have also been credited for enhancing the functionalities of mainstream media, in addition to creating new communicative affordances. Nonetheless, these media have their own weaknesses, and here we're talking about both mainstream media and also new digital communication platforms. But I'll focus mainly on the caveats in mainstream media. So there are about 5 that I could come up with, which seem to have a profound effect on the kinds of narratives that mainstream media circulate. The first one is elitism. Mainstream media tend to amplify the voices, elitist voices in society through the value of prominence. So when mainstream media are talking about credible sources, they're usually referring to people that are already in elite circles. These can be political leaders, business leaders, opinion drivers, experts of one kind or the other, and so forth. And the unfortunate part with this approach is that elite voices tend to have a narrow focus or a narrow perspective in terms of how society should be organized and the position of people in such societies. They also tend to further the interests of already powerful forces in society, and this can be business interests or political interests or social cultural interests and so forth. And the dominance of such elitist forces is reinforced through all these particular social actors. The second factor that sort of creates a democratic deficit in the operations of mainstream media is the moral indifference of objective journalism. So objective journalism is premised on the principle of impartiality, not being biased, using direct quotations from sources, withholding opinion, in other words, avoiding editorialization and other such practices. This, under certain conditions, is not a bad practice. There are certain stories, certain narratives that are better told in such detached ways and so forth. But there are also problems. So to begin with, objective journalism itself is not objective because stories are selected by journalists and editors. The sources are decided by journalists and editors. The quotations that are going to be used in stories are also selected by journalists and editors. So the gatekeeping processes of objective journalism tend to create subtle, inherent operations of bias. That certain sources are quoted directly doesn't really mean that the story will be objective. Sources can be selected strategically to promote a certain narrative, to emphasize certain things at the expense of others, to include certain aspects of that story at the expense of others, and so on and so on. So there is already inherent bias in the practice of objective journalism before we even look at its ability or inability to bring into the fore the moral question in the story. So a journalist's desire to avoid bias, to be impartial, tends to ignore moral imperatives in particular stories. And here, when we think about social justice issues in the news, most of them require some kind of moral standpoint. And when you take an objective approach to journalism, the chances are high that such a moral approach or moralistic approach may be obviated. So there is a practice of moral equivalence in objective journalism. Just to give you an example, if say a woman has been raped, So if a woman has been raped and the journalist has to cover that story, what it means is that the journalist must treat the perspective of the rapist and the perspective of the victim in equal measure. They must be given equal treatment. There mustn't be any judgment in terms of what is wrong or what is right about who is wrong or who is right, and so on and so on. So you're just presenting the facts to the audience without really making any kind of moral evaluation about what has happened. So that absence of moral judgment in stories that clearly have moral questions makes objective journalism a bit impoverished in its coverage of social justice issues. Then the third factor that seems to undermine mainstream journalism's treatment of social justice issues is its association with commercial and political interests. To the extent that mainstream journalism is shaped by who advertises in the media, who owns the media, what resources are made available to which kinds of stories, tends to also shape the kinds of stories that are covered and the angles which they are given in such coverage. So commercial and political interests tend to filter into the journalistic process, thereby promoting stories that align with particular interests, usually of elite forces in society, at the expense of those angles that tend to be important in highlighting social justice issues, especially as far as these affect the marginalized or people living in the margins in society. Then the fourth factor that seems to highlight a bit of a problem with mainstream journalism is that most media are struggling at the moment to raise financial resources. And what that means is because of shrinking advertising owing to the pervasive nature of digital technologies. So this shrinkage in income has meant that journalism's reach into meso and micro social spaces is now severely undermined, meaning that it is highly unlikely for journalistic institutions to deploy journalists into small communities, especially those in the margins, rural areas, coverage of people who are in liminal spaces, and so on and so on. Which means that the media is now much more focused on cosmopolitan locations like big cities, medium-sized cities, and within those cities also sort of elite or affluent spaces. So the shrinkage of resources has also meant that a significant part of resources have been moved from covering social groups that are most likely to be affected or significantly affected by social justice issues in society. Then the last weakness, which I've highlighted in the previous talk, is that of Eurocentrism, which is that journalism tends to assume a Eurocentric approach to reporting issues, which means by so doing it is not diverse enough, or it doesn't accommodate cultural issues, political experiences, the lived realities of people whose lives are not quite in alignment with Eurocentric values or Eurocentric lived experiences, and so on. So what is important is to rethink journalism in light of both the weaknesses of mainstream journalism and also the pressing issues of social justice going into the future. The advent of digital media, it seemed, especially in the early stages of their advent, to compensate for some of these weaknesses by democratizing expanding and democratizing the communicative space to include the voices of the marginalized and other interest groups that bringing into the public domain pressing issues which affect a range of people or different social classes in society, isn't it? There are certain things that are given about these kinds of media. They are generally inclusive, they have a very high participatory element, and they have expanded the ability of industrial journalism to reach to people in the lower ranks of society and to include their voices in public discourse and so on and so on. That all that is acknowledged. But they've also come with equally significant challenges. For instance, the emergence of echo chambers, which reinforce biased voices or in some cases even negative voices, such as racist and supremacist groups, misogynistic voices, and so on and so forth. Things like misinformation, disinformation, the trolling of women, bullying of women, and all of this tends to stunt open and inclusive democratic engagement. And it is for these reasons that, especially in light of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, people have shifted back to traditional media for more credible and verified information. Again, there is a teetering balance in terms of digital media's ability to reinforce democratic societies. While they give a lot with their left hand, they also take away a lot with their right hand. Right. If we come back to mainstream media, the gatekeeping processes that they use sort of tend to some significant degree, ensure that the information that they circulate is verified. And they compensate for the credibility, or they provide a credibility subsidy that seems to be lacking in some of the digital platforms, where audiences don't know what to believe and what not to believe at some point, although there are credible sources that those who know how to search for credible sources can go to. But not everyone does. Media literacy is still a challenge in many societies, and so on and so on. Right. So the objectivity credo, Eurocentrism and elitism remain major challenges in the way journalism reports on the experience of people in the margins across all social levels, at community level, national level, regional level, and in the global divide between the North and the South, isn't it? And it is on this point that it is necessary for us to really rethink journalism and its role in fostering democratic societies. What can be done to expand journalism's ability to do so, in particular as this pertains press and social justice issues in contemporary society? So several solutions have emerged in the recent past through a sort of an explosion of different kinds of more specific forms of journalism: area journalism, solutions journalism, journalism for development, environmental journalism, science journalism, peace journalism, and so on. So in this talk, in the last talk that we are going to have, I'm going to present or offer what we may refer to as a journalism for justice, as a comprehensive framework for thinking the role of journalism, not only in terms of enhancing substantive democracy, meaning democracy that speaks to deeper socio-cultural problems in society, but that also speaks to the broad range of justice issues that afflict society today. So in a context of these asymmetries in political, social, cultural, and economic power, it is imperative to rethink journalism practice if the profession is to remain or to continue to effectively function in the service of democracy. This is more so with regards to reportage on the experiences, realities, and needs of people constantly exposed to the vagaries of poverty, inequality, violent conflict, and climate change, among other things. So in the next talk, I will present the model of journalism for justice. Not that it's perfect, but as a sort of departure point in thinking about how journalism can be more relevant to people in the margins in a more comprehensive and effective way. Thank you.